What is up my people, and welcome back to Technological Journey, episode 10. In the last episode, we set up epoxy resin production down in the chemistry room, and we also built a space station which allowed us to warp to Phobos where we're now mining chlorine. In today's episode, we have one main goal of setting up petrochemistry, and that's going to allow us to get the next fuel source which we're going to use for a long time in this pack, Nitro Benzene. So in between this episode and the last episode, I've just done a bunch of things in preparation for what we're going to do in today's episode. So the first thing that I did was I warped over to a new planet, Titan, and in order to warp to Titan we needed a new artifact for the warp controller. That artifact was a charcoal log, which we needed to make in this compact machine setup here using a miniaturization field. And the reason we warped to Titan was so that we can set up a drill for mining oil. I linked the oil to an ender tank and just put it into a tank over here in fluid storage, so now we're storing normal oil. And I also did an awful lot of weighting and batched up 1039 stainless steel. We're not going to use all of that, but we're going to use over 700 I think it is today for building distillation towers for our petrochemistry distillation setup. And that petrochemistry distillation setup will massively increase our production of benzene, which we're currently producing down here through the pyrolyze oven and the single block distillery. And we're going to use that benzene alongside nitration mixture and distilled water to make our nitro benzene, which we'll use as fuel. Nitration mixture is just sulfuric acid and nitric acid. I'll talk more about all of these recipes later when we actually set it up. And distilled water is just water through a distillery. But in order to get this distillation setup actually set up, obviously, we need a space or a room, because these towers go up to 12 blocks high, and one of the recipes that we're running to get benzene will give us 12 different fluid outputs. So essentially these towers need a lot of space. So in making the room for this, I'm going to kill two birds with one stone. The first one is we're going to obviously make the space, but the second one is we're going to revamp this corridor section here, because I really do not like the way that this corridor is so sort of closed and feels quite small and claustrophobic in comparison to the rest of the base. And I don't really like the way that it doesn't really fit with the theme of all of the interconnected rooms, because it's sort of the only linking section in the base, whereas everywhere else is just a room to another room via a doorway, for example. So I spent a couple of hours planning out a design in a creative world, and I think it's about time that we get this set up now. So there we go. This is the new petrochemistry / nitrobenzene production room. Now this is all chunk aligned, and we've got spaces for different multi-block machines here. So we've got 3 slots there, we've got some more slots along this back wall, all of which are separated so that they're not overlapping on chunk borders, and then we have another 3 on this side here. We also have a space here which I'll talk about in a second, but I also wanted to try and maximise the space possible in this room and leave it much more open than we previously had here. So I made this little platform up here, and we also have a possible platform up out the back here for expansion later. And talking of expansion, one thing I realised is it's always good to leave yourself with exits when building a room for future expansion. So we have an exit there and an exit there. But now talking about this little space here, this 5x5 area of blue mist blocks I've placed, this is where we're going to be placing our distillation towers. Now even though the distillation tower itself is only a 3x3 multi-block, if we were to wall share the multi-block we can fit 4 within a 5x5 area, and we have enough room there to build up to 23 high, So one of them will be 23 high, the other two I think will be 22 high, and then the other one will only be 5 high. I'll explain what the process is for each one will be later. But the next step really is just to craft up the stainless steel casings and get everything sorted for those distillation towers. Now, before we do that, a quick thing about how the distillation tower works if you've never seen it before. So obviously we have the maintenance hatch, which is the same as on an EBF or a vacuum freeze or any other multi-block really. We obviously have the energy input hatch, the controller, an output bus. One of the key things about a distillation tower though is the input hatch for fluids has to be in the bottom middle block. And then you have a bunch of different output hatches for fluids up here. But for each recipe which has multiple fluids, you'll obviously see that they're in an order in JEI here, and that's the order in which they come out in the hatches. So the first hatch will be for heavy fuel for this example, second one will be for naphtha, third one for toluene, benzene, butene, etc. So let's go ahead and install them, and I'll talk about what we're going to run through them in a second. And all we should need to do now is place the 4 controllers in the towers, and if everything has gone right, then we should see the multi-blocks form. So that one's formed, that's a good start. That one's also formed. Now I need to go around the back. That's formed, and that's formed. Lovely. So these maintenance hatches around the back are going to be a bit of a pain to access for now, but we can upgrade these to auto maintenance hatches later, and we are very soon going to be crafting duct tape, which will essentially make these so we never have to really interact with them. So as you can see, we have our 5 high distillation tower and then the other 3 which are taller. Now we're going to have to craft up I think around 40 interfaces, because the best way to do this to minimise lag is to put a single fluid interface on each of these outputs, and that requires an awful large amount of tin, which I've been out mining and it's just smelting up now, so that could take a while, but we'll get there eventually. So through this 5 block high distillation tower here, we're going to be distilling our oil, and that will give us the 4 products here: the sulfuric heavy fuel, the sulfuric light fuel, sulfuric naphtha and sulfuric gas. Now these 3 here I'll talk about after, but the sulfuric gas is just essentially, from what I can see, it's a relatively useless byproduct. You can use it to make hydrogen sulfide, which can be used for some reactions later, but doesn't have anything too particularly interesting. The heavy fuel, the light fuel and the naphtha, however, if we combine them individually in a chemical reactor with hydrogen, then we get the non-sulfuric version, so we'll get naphtha, light fuel and heavy fuel. And those chemical reactors I'm probably going to place in here. They'll be single blocks for now, but we can switch them over to LCRs. And then if we take the normal version of each of these things and we run them through this multi-block here called the cracking unit with steam or with hydrogen, we either get hydro cracked and then the type, or we get steam cracked and then the name. Now they give similar outputs, although hydro cracked when distilled gives fewer chemicals at higher abundances, and steam cracked gives more chemicals at lower abundances. So I'm going to go with the steam cracked version for now, because we're going to be running 3 different towers for naphtha, light fuel and heavy fuel, and they do give slightly different outputs, but they're all very similar, so we're going to be stocking up a fair amount of these chemicals anyway, so we don't need to go for the version that gives less outputs at a more abundant rate. And the cracking units I originally didn't plan for down in this section, but this little platform up here is going to be a perfect space for them. So there are 3x5 multi-block, and I've also crafted up everything we need to build them here. They weren't too expensive really, just some HV circuits and some copper nickel coils. So let's just go ahead and place 3 cracking units down here. These are all chunk aligned as well, so that they're not overlapping on chunk borders. So they're all built up, And I also went ahead and moved our second bronze boiler from down here, because we're no longer using it, back up and over into this room here. And that is going to create us the steam that we need to steam crack the 3 different fuels through the cracking unit. I also went ahead and crafted up 3 chemical reactors and 3 electrolyzers, all at MV tier. And I'm just going to place these in here. Whereabouts should I place these? Probably just something like this for now. Doesn't have to be too neat, because we're going to change these over to LCRs, and I'm not sure what we're going to do with the electrolyzers just yet, but they might get upgraded to a single big electrolyzer behind. But what these are for here is these are for the step after the oil distillation and before the steam cracking. So this is the step where we turn our sulfuric fuel into our normal fuel. So if we look at the heavy fuel example and we look at the uses for this, we need to combine it with hydrogen in a chemical reactor and an integrated circuit on 0, and it gives us hydrogen sulfide and heavy fuel. So that's what the 3 chemical reactors are for, each for their respective fuel type. And then the hydrogen sulfide is a constant in all of the reactions, so you get 1 bucket of hydrogen sulfide per every 2 buckets of hydrogen input in each reaction. And the electrolyzer is because we can turn this single bucket of hydrogen sulfide from each reaction back into 2 buckets of hydrogen and a sulfur dust. That means that we can recycle the hydrogen for each chemical reactor, and then we just get an extra sulfur dust as another output from the system. So I also just went ahead and made this fluid terminal to add on to our applied logistics system, and this just allows us to see all of the fluids we've got stored over in main storage in one place. And I'm going to use this fluid terminal just to see what we've got stored and go through this, because these are all of the outputs at every step of the process of this petrochemistry distillation. And I'm just going to go through and see which ones we've already got stored and which ones we need to store. And then I'll come back and we'll know how many fluid tanks we need to go and add over into fluid storage. So it looks like we need all of these. Now let's just count how many that is. That's 1, 2, 3, 17, 18. So we need to make 18 tanks. So let's put a pretty big order for 18 through here. I'm not sure if our single crafting storage is going to be able to handle this at the moment. And we're also out of steel. I'm hoping that that's just a buffer issue and not that we've actually run out of iron. Yeah, so this is running, so it looks like this is just a buffer issue. And that'll be because I've been crafting up all of the fluid interfaces that we need for down there. So we're just going to have to wait for the steel to restock, craft up our 18 tanks, and then we're ready to place them over in fluid storage. So I crafted up 9 tanks, and rather than doing 18 tanks, I crafted up 9 1K fluid storage cells as well. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to put all of the intermediate steps, so like all the steam cracked fuels, the normal fuels and the sulfuric fuels, I'm going to put them into partitioned fluid storage cells as opposed to super tanks. And that's just because I don't want to have to expand the room just because we've got so many fluid tanks here for petrochemistry fluids, when in reality I probably just want the output fluids here, because we don't need to store as many of the intermediate fluids and we can just fit them all in this single drive block here. But in order to partition the drives, which essentially means that for one drive you can only store 1 chemical on it, and the reason I actually did that was just so then we can store, I think it's about 4,000 buckets. It might even be 8,000 on a single fluid storage cell of each fluid type, and it means that they don't get mixed up and they're easy to transport, etc. And to do that, I've got a cell workbench, which was a pretty simple recipe, just needed a calculation processor. Oh, and these fluid storage cells are just the same as an item cell, only they use, I think it's lapis instead of something else. And then you just put the storage cell up in here, and then you choose the fluid you want to partition it to. I'm going to do sulfuric heavy fuel for the first one. Plop that in there. Yeah, so just plop that in there, and you take it out, and then it says partitioned includes precise sulfuric heavy fuel. So I'm going to go ahead and partition these, and while I'm doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and auto craft up some fluid storage buses to put on these super tanks over in main storage. And that's our last partitioned cell there. So if I just go ahead and chuck these over into the ME drive. Now these shouldn't start filling up because we don't have any of these fluids in the storage yet. Yeah, and that's perfect because the reason they're yellow, so normally what happens is the drive stays green and then yellow when it's got the full storage in terms of types, and then red when it's got the full storage in terms of bytes. So that shows that it's got the full storage in terms of types, which is good because it means that we're only storing one thing per drive. Or per cell, sorry. And with the storage buses crafted up, we can now begin to work on our tanks over here in storage. And the reason we've only got 9 as opposed to 11 is because methane we already have a tank for and benzene we already have a tank for. So let's just go ahead and place these all down here. And now we just have these fluids up here that we need to partition each drive to, or each tank, sorry. Now I have no idea if I've spelt this right, but that should be the last one. And now I just need to go ahead and actually partition them with the fluid storage buses. So that's all done and these are all hooked up. Now we might need to hook some of these individual chemicals up into the overflow trash can at some point, just depending on which ones fill up first. But I'm going to do that when we get to it, just because I don't really feel like going through and doing all the maths based on the exact millibucket output of each distillation recipe. But now we've got all of the fluid storage hooked up and we have all of the multi-blocks built, we just have an awful lot of cabling and wiring and interface setting up to do in order to get this entire system working. So I'm not sure how long that's going to take, but let's see how quick I can get that done, eh? Could be a long and complicated journey. So there we go, we now have our entire petrochemistry room up and running. And I must say that this is extremely satisfying to watch everything run, especially these distillation towers here. Just look at this. I upgraded the one that's distilling oil into the sulfuric variants to HV rather than MV, because this has currently got a huge backlog of oil to process through that was just accumulating in our tank from the drill while we were building the entire system. Yeah, over 1.7 million buckets of oil. Or millibuckets. So that's the limiting factor at the moment. I'm not sure what would be the limiting factor after that. Probably the cracking units and maybe the distillation towers. These reactors actually seem to be keeping up extremely well over there. So I'm not sure if we're going to need to upgrade these to LCRs for a very long time yet. But if we take a look at fluid storage, actually, now we have the fluid terminal, we can just go over there and see everything happening in one, can't we? So over here in the fluid terminal, you can see we're getting a bunch of different new chemicals. So let's look at benzene, for example. So when I finished setting this up, we were at about 130 buckets. So we've already got up to 190 buckets in probably what's been less than 15 minutes. So that's extremely good. We've also got 10 buckets of this cyclopentadiene, which I'm not sure what it's used for, but this is the least abundant one out of the entire process. And that's because you only get it through the distillation tower for distilling naphtha, or distilling steam cracked naphtha. It doesn't come out of the other two. So that's always a good one to look for in terms of how much we produced, because it's obviously everything else we're going to have more than that. Something else that's quite useful is ethylene, which we now have 135 buckets of. Toluene we have 19.5 buckets. Oh, so we're actually stocking up steam cracked fuel, so it looks like the distillation towers will be a bottleneck before the cracking units. But that's okay. Anyway, even now we've got this all set up, we're still not finished with this room for today's episode, because we still have some more chemical processes to set up in terms of creating our Nitro Benzene from the benzene which we're now producing from this distillation tower. And that is what these 5 slots here and these 3 slots here are for. Now this probably will get upgraded to LCRs ASAP as soon as we get them, which will probably be next episode, although I'm aware I said that last episode and then we never actually got around to doing it this episode, so just ASAP really. So like I mentioned earlier, we use benzene, which we're now producing, distilled water, which is just water through a distillery, easy to get, and then we use nitration mixture. Now nitration mixture is made with 1 bucket of sulfuric acid and 1 bucket of nitric acid, and that produces us 2 buckets of nitration mixture. Now the nitration mixture recipe gives us 1 bucket of diluted sulfuric acid for every 2 buckets of nitration mixture, which means we get 1 bucket of diluted sulfuric acid for every 1 bucket of sulfuric acid that we put in. So we can recycle this diluted sulfuric acid back into sulfuric acid at a 3:2 ratio, so it's not a perfect ratio, but we can do some recycling there. But sulfuric acid we've set up many times before. It's just as simple as water and sulfur trioxide, which is made with sulfur dioxide, it's made with sulfur dust and oxygen in a chemical reactor. The nitric acid, however, I don't think we've made before, and that's just made with water and nitrogen dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide is as simple as nitrogen and oxygen. So it's relatively simple, and we just have a couple of bits and pieces to set up. These here are for the chemical reactors, and then these are for the other machines in the process. So the majority of this setup is now complete. There's just a little bit extra that I would like to talk through as I build this. And the reason we're doing this one slightly differently to the rest of the setups we've got previously is because where possible we want to move away from using Ender-IO conduits, because when there are really abundant and complicated networks that use them, they can cause some frame rate lag when looking over. Now small networks like this aren't really going to be too much of an issue, and even on this scale it's not going to be too much of an issue, but it's a good habit to get into. But before I talk about that, I went out to find some cactus to make some green covered cable, which I'll explain why in a second. But I found a village and I got these dark boots and an Ender-IO sword, so if you hear a strange sound effect whenever I jump, that's just these boots here. But the reason we needed this green cable, well, we don't need green cable, but I've chose to do it to make it easier to see, is because we're going to be using an AE2 subnet to route chemicals, or route chemicals, sorry, throughout the different machines in this chemical line here. And I want to separate that with a different colour cable so it's easier to manage. Now, essentially what a subnet is it's an AE2 network that's separate from our main network, but powered by our main network. So what that means is that we can use storage buses on top of these machines, and it will notify the system that there is a certain amount of whatever fluid you've got set in here in the output, if there is of course, and then you can use an interface on the same subnetwork to insert the chemical which is stored in one of the machines into one of the other machines. You can obviously do this on the main network as well, but if you were to do that on the main network, it would mean that the main network would have access to what's in this machine, and it would also import from the main network into this machine, which we don't want to do because we want this to be a closed system. Now some of these interfaces here are already connected up to the main network, and that's just where we want to import/export chemicals into the main network. So this, we're exporting the final chemicals for our Nitro Benzene into the main network, and some of these also have imports from the main network as well, which are just fluids which you've got stocked up in bulk in fluid storage. But all of these interfaces which are disconnected need to be on a subnetwork, and that's where I'm going to use these green cables. So I just need to connect all of these interfaces together here, and I need to make sure that they don't connect onto these cables here. And in order to do that, I've crafted up some cable anchors, which are super easy, just some sort of ingot. I think I used iron, and a nether quartz cutting knife gives you 3. And what these essentially allow you to do is they allow you to place it. So say we had a cable here, it would obviously connect there, but if we place a cable anchor here and then place a cable here, these two cables don't connect, so the channels stay separate. So I'm just going to go ahead, go round and connect up all of the interfaces using green cables. So there we go. So these green cables and these interfaces on the subnetwork are now all connected, with a couple of cable anchors just stopping the connections where needed. Now I'm going to go ahead and connect these normal cables up to the main network here. So now these machines should be getting power because these generators will be filling up with biodiesel. We obviously will change this over to Nitro Benzene at some point, but we don't need to do that right now because we don't have a decent stock. And I actually need to add pumps onto these generators. So now we've got that, some of these machines will start to run. So as you can see, this distillery here making distilled water is running. And that's because the only input it needs is from the main network, which is already connected. And now the sub-network, however, is not online. So all of these machines, not all of these machines, sorry, are going to be running. But as you can see, we're getting distilled water here, and that means that this storage bus will notify the subnetwork that there is distilled water in the system. Now this is where it gets a little bit different. So we need to connect up the subnetwork to the main network without transmitting channels. And to do that, we're going to use quartz fibre. So if I place a quartz fibre here, what quartz fibre is essentially it only transmits power and not channels. And then if we connect this up to there, the subnetwork now has power, so it should be running. So if I've hooked this up correctly, we should see the distilled water from there get taken out and get put over here into the Nitro Benzene reactor. And it has worked perfectly, so now we just need to wait a little bit for this to get up and running, and then we should be producing Nitro Benzene, and we just need to add a tank for Nitro Benzene over in fluid storage. Obviously these are all going to be upgraded to LCRs at some point, and large mixers and large distilleries. I mean, to be honest, we can probably just upgrade the distillery single block machine because it's not too fast. I mean, too slow. But yeah, so now we have Nitro Benzene being produced. So I added a fluid tank for Nitro Benzene in main fluid storage, and I level limit it to store 1,000,000 millibuckets, similar to how we had with biodiesel. And on that note, I think it's a good place to wrap up today's episode. Now, even though we didn't get LCRs, which we said we were going to do last episode, we have made an awful lot of progress today. We built an entire new room, we've set up a huge new set of infrastructure, and we've also got the next fuel that we're going to use for a decent time in this pack. Now, as I mentioned in the comments of one of the older episodes, every 10 episodes or so I'll be releasing a world download and a world tour to go along with that. So in the next couple of days there'll be a video coming out, just a quick catch up on what we've done so far in these first 10 episodes, and then there'll be a world download file attached to that or with linked in the description that you can download from. That's just so that if anybody wants to start watching the series in episode 11, 12, 13, they can watch the episode 10 recap and then not have to watch through the first 10 episodes if they don't want to. But for those of you that are watching here and now, thank you very much for sticking through the video. As usual, if you enjoyed the video, please do leave a like. If you're enjoying the series, please subscribe so that you don't miss any future uploads. And I'd greatly appreciate if you leave a silly comment or a comment letting me know what I could change, what I could do better, or what you want to see done in this series. And on that note, it's been me. Bye.
To the forest where we found